bring scientists together with regional leaders. We try and get as much data about each of the different aspects of a region. The regional leaders bring the local knowledge and the local issues, and they temper it and they talk about it, and they're able to define the series of risks that is relevant for their region and the things they need to deal with. Also importantly, it helps to put a temporal nature around the risk dimension. People who are trying to cope with the impacts of climate change and understand it sort of add up all the risk and think they've got to respond to everything simultaneously. But going through these processes helps to put the time dimension around when you actually really do need to act on a certain risk. And for the processes we've run, well, for the few regions that have already gone through this process, biodiversity was actually the big risk. Most other aspects of the society or the economy had sufficient adaptive capacity already built into the system. They can cope with the next 2 decades of change, but it's biodiversity that looks like it's going to fall over the edge quickest, and so a region will need to start thinking about how they're going to deal with that. I also got to acknowledge the work of Dr. Jacqueline Bolston from the University of South Australia, who was the principal architect of this methodology that we use in South Australia and we promote. Borrowing from many eminent authors such as yourself. So adaptation planning. So where do we go? So we take the outcomes from the IBA, and it's up to the regional leaders, the trusted leaders, to take the specific things that are relevant to community X, to go and work with that community and figure out how to respond to the impacts of climate change that are relevant to them. So it's very much trying to demystify the whole stuff around climate change impacts by talking about the issue that is relevant to the specific person. And that's very much far more engaging in terms of getting them to commit to actual action. Then you go through your various options assessment processes and come up with your adaptation plan. And it's about embedding this. I mean, we're in the first cycle, but this is about getting everything that we do now as a separate adaptation process to become mainstream business to every decision process that we enter. So, second last slide. The benefits of this approach is we found it a very cost-effective form of engagement in getting people on board. We're using existing networks. We're accessing local knowledge. Importantly, everyone had that little pool of funding they could bring to the table, and it's been a very effective mechanism of getting cooperative agreement and getting larger projects funded to drive the reform. It gives us an ability then to leverage the universities and have a more strategic scientific approach. It identifies who's responsible. Having participated in the process, you know that if you manage asset or service, a particular asset or service, you have risks that you now need to manage in the context of climate change. So it really helps to clarify who's responsible and where government is responsible. It gives regions a very strong say in their future, and I mean that was one of the core components of why we went down this path. And it builds their capacity for leadership, because it gives them the ability to lead their community through these changes. Oh, sorry, second last slide. So where are we at? There's 12 regions. It's genuinely second last. There's 12 regions. So we've got 3 regions that have got regional agreements. We've got 4 regions who are commencing their integrated vulnerability assessments. We've got 2 that have finished their IBAs and are entering their planning process. So we're well down the path of implementation. And so I hope you've had sufficient taste of the various flavours that I've offered. If you're wanting to purchase a single cone or a double cone, perhaps with chocolate dip, there's our contact details if you wish to know more detail. So, how do I go for time? Okay, I was told I had to do a climate change joke, so I will. So what's one of the benefits of climate change? As a golfer, I only ever need to use a sand wedge and a putter.
Do we applaud the joke? Thanks, Rowan. We have some time now for questions and discussion, and I'd like to ask Jean if she'd like to come up and lead the... Are you going to lead the questions? No, I can, all right. So do I have some questions for any of our speakers from our audience here? Oh, you're all thinking about lunch. We've got one here, sir.
My name is Raimund Rötter from MTT Agri-Food Research Finland. I have a question to Mark Howden. Very interesting presentation. I have only one thing came to my mind. You said that adaptation is appropriate for the current situation. And I was asking, what are your criteria to say so? Is it appropriate for the knowledge that there is about likely futures? I'm not saying that it's not happening a lot, but just I would like to know your criteria.
So that essentially was a judgment statement. So it's not, based on scientific criteria. But what it is based on is that what we're seeing is a lot of in-system change already. So people are responding to the climate they're experiencing, and that's appropriate. And we're also seeing some people making judgments about future climate and climate trajectories based on their understanding of climate change, and they're making that judgment call, that risk assessment, that the benefits are going to outweigh the costs of making that, and the risks, and I think that's also appropriate. And this is happening within a context of where there are significant trends in many of the climate variables that we're seeing, but those climate variables have not moved out of the envelope of past variation. So we're still within historical variation. So we cannot, conclusively say at this point that we are, in a new environment where that climate adaptation becomes a necessity rather than an option.
There's another question down just behind that gentleman.
Thank you. Mike Moorcroft, also like Nick from Natural England. My question actually goes back to your introduction, Sarah. In the question of projections, and much climate change work has started with an assessment of projections, and that takes you down a particular road. Do you think that in terms of developing adaptation and dealing with uncertainty, we would be better off starting with vulnerability as opposed to projections, or do they both go side by side?
Jean wants to ask, okay, yep.
If I could speak to this, because it's something that's close to my heart, I think I would say. I get frustrated, and I have 2 Australian colleagues sitting on the platform, so maybe I have to be a little bit careful what I say. But I get frustrated by the dialogue between end users, that's the people who are practitioners who are actually trying to do something about climate change, and scientists around uncertainty. Where the dialogue runs something like the scientists saying, "Oh, okay, this is a projection for what will happen in the future, and this is the likelihood or uncertainty range on this projection." And then the stakeholder says, "Well, this is so uncertain, I really can't do anything about this." And then the scientist says, "Well, how can I help you? I can almost pervert the science in order to try and give you a hard and fast prediction as opposed to a projection, but actually you shouldn't be working with this," and the stakeholder almost ignores that and goes forward with a single number which is dear to their heart. And I think this is really a very frustrating conversation that goes on a lot of the time, and many of the administrations in Australia are locked into producing very high resolution scenarios of future climate change, where it's really very unclear what it is that they're going to be able to do with them once they've got them. But it's almost like a holding action. So we're not quite sure what we're going to do about this problem of climate change. So while we're wondering about what to do, we'll spend quite a bit of money creating these high resolution scenarios, but we're not really quite clear what we're going to do about them. So your original question, I have now wandered round the bush for quite some time. Your original question was, do you think we'd be better off starting by thinking about our vulnerability and our resilience? And I absolutely agree with you. And I think the way to do that is to essentially carry out a sensitivity study. And that's a bit of an empty space, and I think it's a huge mistake not to be saying, okay, so if the temperature increased by this much and the rainfall declined by that much, what kind of a state would we be in? And we don't explore that question enough. So actually Mark and Rowan might like to comment on that, yes. And Cynthia would too, so ladies first, I guess. Back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, you've prompted obviously a very passionate question for our panel. Cynthia wishes to say something, then Mark, then Kirsten, then Rowan. So, and if anyone else in between wants to go. So, Cynthia?
Well, I really don't like to disagree with my very dear colleague Jean, but I actually think that for this very challenging issue that we have in front of us of adapting effectively to climate change, to a change in climate conditions, we have to bring to bear all the information possible. We have to learn how to bring to bear that information effectively. But I think that it's really important for stakeholders, and I speak from experience with working with New York City decision makers for many years, and working with them to show them what the projections are so they can understand, well, why are we bringing forward climate change as an issue at all? Because if you only look at, oh, well, here's plus or minus, you're doing on the sensitivity side, you don't, the decision makers don't have a sense of why in the long term climate change is such a vital issue to address.
Okay, thanks, Sophia. So, Mark?
Well, I've got a different view again. I'd actually say you don't start with either the projections or the vulnerability side of things. You start out with those stakeholders' values, their goals and their decisions, and from that you actually understand which of those decisions are climate sensitive, and then you can bring in information on climate projections and understand how those decisions need to change to actually either meet those goals or change those goals. And then you can start to actually go down an adaptation strategy route. And to some extent that's the sort of thing that Rowan was describing there, but with an institutional framing of that. And it's actually starting out with those things that those people in those regions find valuable. And that's a very different framing from the science one, which is usually promoted.
Kirsten?
In my regard, it's also context specific. As we try to find out when we were adapting the two different concepts of ecological security and vulnerability to the cases and finding out how cities are acting. What we wanted to say is, or what we found out was that this is very context specific. That, for example, cities in the global south that have other problems than ecological security or protection of nature. So maybe it's more related to just jumping into vulnerabilities and seeing what are the impacts and adapting to the vulnerabilities. So I don't say that they shouldn't adapt to or trying to protect nature, but I think it's an issue of the context of what the main pressing issues in each of the countries or cities are. So it might be a difference of how they respond, if they respond to protectional issues or to vulnerabilities.
Rowan?
So, I don't do it, because I agree with what everyone said so far. It is about bringing together the values. You pick different models because you need different futures to understand how vulnerable you are and what the sensitivity is. But I would say, in the face of massive uncertainty, one of the things that I think is most important is for a region to actually have a vision about its future and to drive towards the vision and drive towards the positive. Because if you try to manage all the negatives, you can never quite keep up. So an important part of the process is saying, where do I want to go? What do I want to be? Stage one. How am I vulnerable to that? And what investment do I need to make to treat the most important vulnerabilities?
We also have Salim Haki, who's one of our co-conveners and is probably really our only developing country representative. So Salim, did you want to add anything to this?
Sure. I think this is a very fascinating conversation and discussions. One of my reflections, having worked in developing countries, particularly some of the least developed countries, is the motivation for them is climate is already changing and they're actually having to deal with it. So my, if you like, analogy for how I see the developed countries dealing with this question of uncertainty and the poorer developing countries doing it is sort of like trying to climb a mountain, a very high mountain, which is, the summit is in the clouds, you don't know where it is. And developed countries want to send up satellites and find information and develop, oxygen masks preparing to climb up this mountain. Whereas the developing countries are like, barefoot Sherpas. They're going up here, going up there, trying to find a way up and seeing which way they can do. And we need both. I think we're going to, the solutions for how the world generally is going to adapt to climate change is a combination of experiential knowledge that is actually being gained very, very rapidly on the ground by these countries and communities, with the more scientific knowledge that is generally more developed in developing countries, but needs to be supported in developed countries, but needs to be supported in developing countries. And the opportunity for adaptation to be an area where we have a genuine collaboration of both sides learning from each other, I think is a very, very big opportunity that we should be thinking about.
Great, thank you. I know we had another question down the front here.